Everyone, nice to see you. For those of you who may not know us, I'm Nayaswamis Jyotish, and this is my wife, Nayaswamis Devi, and we don't know where we live. We're mainly based at Ananda Village, but we're the spiritual directors, so we travel all over. And in fact, next Saturday we're going to be leaving for a short trip to India. So at any rate, we're expressing in these bodies the omnipresence, which is puts a lot of miles on them when you still have to drag the body around. So today we're going to talk about this, what seems to be a rather obscure subject of, was Jesus the Son of God? Was he God in fact? Or was he the son of Mary, a person? Was he the son of man? And so, which of those was he? Now, it seems like, well, this is a kind of a esoteric argument. No need to get very riled up about it. But in fact, in the early Christian church, as the church spread, so, it came first, of course, from Israel, which is where Jesus lived. And then it began to spread after his passing, and it came to Rome. St. Paul and St. John came to Rome. St. Peter and St. Paul came to Rome, and they spread the word in Greece and Rome, and other of the disciples went elsewhere around the world, and the teachings of Christ began to spread. Well, a century or so later, even though they had spread, all the different areas were interpreting that differently. And one of the major conflicts was whether Jesus was the Son of God or whether Jesus was the Son of Man. And there were literally wars fought over this. The sects were fighting with each other, and they couldn't come together. And the kings and shahs and whatever the rulers of these lands were going crazy because all these Christians were fighting with each other, and they couldn't produce any peace in their realm. And so they had a big conference, the Nicene Conference. I think it was 436, sometime in there. And they tried to pin down these questions. Is Jesus a God, or is he a man? And there was a big argument about that. And Master tells a story of how it was decided, because at that time there was this great saint, Saint Anthony. And so he lived in the desert, and he had achieved cosmic consciousness. So all these bishops, and they were bishops at that time. I don't think they had cardinals yet. Anyway, they were all arguing and fighting, and this big argument going on. And finally, St. Anthony came in and finished the argument completely with just one simple sentence. He said, "I have seen him," meaning I've seen Christ. So he couldn't be simply a man the way everybody accepted, or part of the group accepted that he had to be. I have seen him. He's more than just a man. He's currently present in the world. And so that settled that argument, except it didn't really settle it because people like to fight. And so the argument continued on. But even though this seems a little bit esoteric, it is still the lingering elements of that continue today, because the Western consciousness especially likes to categorize things. It's either this or it's that. Either he's a man or he's the Son of God. Swami Kriyananda, one time when we were starting our work in Italy, in Assisi, the Catholic Church ignored us as long as we didn't have much energy going. But as more and more people began to come, and as we began to give conferences, it became a threat to them. And so the Catholic Church was actively trying to suppress Ananda. And so Swami decided that he should go and meet the bishop of Assisi and talk with him. And so he went, and they had a very nice talk. They were both educated, they were both intelligent, they both spoke many languages, so on. And Swami was getting ready to leave. And the bishop said, "You know, you're a very nice fellow. I wish you were a Christian." And Swami said, "But I am a Christian." And the bishop said, "No, you aren't." See, his thinking was, if you don't have the belief system that our sect or our church or our group has, then you can't be a Christian. And so he said, "No, you aren't." And Swami said, "Yes, I am." And so the bishop said, "No, you aren't." And Swami knew that this could go on a long time. So he said, "Well, you say I'm not a Christian, and I say I am a Christian. Let's leave it up to Christ to decide." And that ended the argument. But this question of are you this or are you that lingers. Look at today's politics. Look at today's world. Look at today's science. Either it's this or it's that, and it can't be both. But in ancient times, or in Kali Yuga, where the consciousness of mankind was limited to form, it had to be either this or that. But now we're beginning to break out of that in Dwapara Yuga. We're beginning to see that it can be both and. And so Einstein came along and he said that matter and energy are the same thing. See, before that, the thinking was it's either matter or it's energy, but it can't be both and. Einstein said, no, it isn't. It's not either or. It's both and. And it depends on the form, but that's his famous formula, E equals mc squared. Energy and matter. E is energy, M is matter. And the two equal each other. And it just depends on what state of one could call expansion, or how energized it is. Matter becomes energy when it is already in essence. But it goes even farther than that, because in quantum physics, which is now just coming into the flow of mankind, even down to the subatomic particles, it's both and, not either or. And so in atomic and quantum computers are coming along, but the mind, because we're stuck still in a kind of form, our minds are, we don't easily understand or accept this. Even Einstein didn't accept this either or thing. He called it, what was it? Spooky action at a distance. Because you can get two subatomic particles or quanta entangled and they can be separated, and you change one and it immediately changes the other. And it just seems odd. But it's even worse than that. There's a famous thought experiment called Schrodinger's cat. And so imagine a cat in a box, and the box is closed. You don't know whether that cat is alive or dead inside that box, right? Seems obvious. In quantum physics, it's both alive and dead at the same time. And you don't know which it is. And it's both until you open the box and look, and then it becomes either alive or dead. It freezes into one or the other. So it's both and one or the other at the same time. Coming back to Jesus, he was both and, and one or the other. He was the Son of Man, and he was the cosmic universe, both at the same time. So when we come, the interesting thing is it's not about Jesus, it's about you and me. We are both everything in the universe, and we're this body at one and the same time. Except that when we've come into the body or into the ego, it's like we've observed the cat and then we've frozen it. Because our infinite potential has now become, as Swami Kriyananda calls it, a bundle of self-definitions. And so out of, you're both a man and a woman, but when you freeze it, you're one or the other. You're both, blonde or brunette or gray. But you freeze it and you become one or the other. And so as you come into ego and it gets frozen, your infinite potential gets frozen into either ors. And in that either or, then we can go and we can have wars over whether you're the Son of Man or the Son of God, or whether you're one or the other. And it's still, as I say, it's still continuing. This battle of either or is still continuing and creating conflict and enmity and discord throughout all of society. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to roll back that either or consciousness in ourselves. The ego, the frozen ego, we're trying to roll that back and get back to our infinite potential. And that's done, the teachings of yoga say that's done, not just yoga, the teachings of all religions say that if you sufficiently still the mind and still the feelings, then you begin to perceive yourself not as the bundle of self-definitions, but as your infinite potential. And ultimately, you come into a state of complete stillness and you go into samadhi. And in that state of samadhi, you see yourself not as either or, but as both and everything. And the great masters, there are two states of samadhi. The first, you have to be withdrawn. Your energy has to be withdrawn because you can't hold that state of consciousness and then be in the moving around in a body. It's just too hard. Master said, then there's a further state called nirvikalpa samadhi where you maintain that state of everythingness while at the same time you're in a body. Master said that's very hard to do. He said sometimes later on, it's hard to keep this one body moving because I feel myself in all bodies. Master said that he knew all of the thoughts of all of his disciples. Now, because we're stuck in a body consciousness, at least I'll say it for myself, I'm stuck in a body consciousness, I interpret that as Master in his body, in his personality, was able to somehow kind of mind read, like he was a radio receiver and he could hear subtle programming from someone else and be able to tell what their thoughts were. But that wasn't it at all. It wasn't he was receiving somebody else. He was the other person. And so he was everyone. And so where did his thoughts in his body stop being his thoughts and being someone else's? So in that greater state, he was everything. But he said it was very difficult to hold that consciousness of everythingness while still functioning in a body. And one time Swami went to him and said, another brother monk, he said, he's having a difficulty. And Master just pulled back and said, oh, I see what you mean. And Swami didn't want to leave it at that. He said, well, didn't you know already? And that's when Master said it's very difficult to maintain that consciousness of being everything at the same time that you're trying to move through one body and speak through one voice. But that's our nature. Ultimately, that's our nature, that we're both and. We're everything and we're one thing. So Christ was not only the Son of Man, he was the Son of God, he was God. Krishna was not only Krishna, the entity that was driving a chariot, but he was also all the universes, all of the light, everything that exists, both at the same time. But it's not just them. It's us too. We are both and. Right now you're already in samadhi, except that your consciousness has you frozen as either dead or alive, as the cat that you are. But you're everything, you're all potential. And so our job, the path, gives us tools to wind back that either-or consciousness to become the both-and consciousness of our true infinite potential. But it's not something foreign to us. We're already there. It's just that one might say the state of our energy state is lowered and we haven't expanded enough to realize it yet. But it's coming. As Swami said, he was in a tableau and he played the part of Jesus, and he came back and Master said, oh, they loved you in that tableau. They said you looked so much like Jesus. And Swami said, well, I'd rather be like him than look like him, making a little bit of a joke, you know. And Master didn't take it as a joke. Master took it as something serious. I'd rather be Jesus. I'd rather be what his consciousness was, rather than just look like the body. And Master said, that'll come. So he said it through Swami to all of us. We would all rather be like a Christ than look like a Christ. That'll come.
I'll also share a few words this morning. And first I want to take a moment to thank all of you for coming today, but also those who participated over this weekend. And we had such a lovely time, and just thank you all. It was a joy to be with you. And we'll be coming back in for the Yogananda Fest in, when is it? July. In July. Okay, so we'll be coming back in a few months and be able to spend a longer time. Well, just to pick up the theme that Jyotish was talking about, Master talked so much about and emphasized the importance of this concept of Christ consciousness. And he said, even the name, we think of Jesus Christ as sort of a first name and a last name. Christ is a title. It's derivative from the same word actually as Krishna, and it means the anointed or the enlightened. And so it's really Jesus the Christ, Jesus the enlightened. And Master said this Christ consciousness is not particular to any religion, not particular to any time or culture. It's a universal, timeless, eternal state of consciousness that we all are moving towards. In the reading that we heard this morning, it said even the meanest beggar, the lowliest beggar at some point will live a life that is as great as the greatest saga ever told. And so we need to, it's hard to imagine that, but we are on an evolutionary track, our consciousness is, and we are moving from ego consciousness, limited consciousness, towards this Christ consciousness. And Master also emphasized, he said, if we think of Christ or any of the great spiritual enlightened beings that we know of who founded great world religions, if we think of them as coming full-blown in all their glory, then it misses the point. They come and they have evolved from exactly the point where each of us now stand. Christ was going through exactly, at some point in his evolutionary track, he went through the same experience, as did Master, as did Buddha, where there were tests and trials that they had to overcome. We read of this even in the lives of these great ones as it was expressed, and we know of them. Buddha went through the period where he, if you know the story of Buddha, it's quite a beautiful story, was born a great prince of great wealth, lived in a pleasure garden and so forth. And at some point, his charioteer takes him out into the city, and he sees for the first time ever, there had been a prophecy about Buddha that a seer came to Buddha's father, the king of the realm, and said, your son will either be a great king or he will be a great soul and he will enlighten mankind. And the king father didn't want his son to leave and disinherit the kingdom, and so he kept him separate from any suffering, made his life perfect. But one day, because that wasn't his destiny, he went out into the world and he saw suffering. He saw old age and disease and poverty. And he said to his friend, what is this? He'd never seen it before. And his friend told him, this is disease and poverty and old age. And he says, does this come to everyone? And he said, yes, my Lord, it does. And at that point, Buddha said, I must find a way out for humanity, out of the suffering. And he went and did extreme tapasya and meditation until that moment when he achieved enlightenment, he achieved Buddhahood, and for the benefit of all mankind. Similarly, Christ was tested. There he was before the final stage of his life, and he went into the wilderness, and he was tested. We read it in the Bible, of the devil. And Satan came to him and said, I will give you dominion over all the world. I would give you all power, all wealth. It was the soul, the final test. Do you want this world, or do you want nothing but renounce the world, but you will have me? And of course, we know Christ said, and we'll hear it in the oratorio, in that beautiful song, The Temptation of Christ, that Swamiji wrote. Christ said, get thee behind me. And at that moment, it was the same as the moment when Buddha realized his oneness with all creation. Christ realized he was free of any shackles, of any shred of material consciousness, and he moved and he became the Christ. Well, Master said that these great ones come not to show us how great they are, how different they are from us, but to show us how we too can tread the path to Christ consciousness. And in fact, Master has a beautiful article, transcribed lecture that he gave in one of his books. I believe it's the Man's Eternal Quest, called Steps Towards Christ Consciousness. Steps towards Christ consciousness. It's not saying it's either or. You're either got it, honey, or you don't. It's saying steps towards Christ consciousness. And he talks about the social way of finding Christ consciousness through good works, through compassion, through helping those that are in need, mentally or physically or emotionally or spiritually, to give of yourself, to see that it's your brother crying by the wayside is you. It's no different. That there's so many beautiful stories of people reaching, the one from St. Francis of Assisi, one of the great saints that Master called his patron saint. He, in the Middle Ages, of course, leprosy was widespread. And he was walking along, wandering in his eternal pilgrimage, St. Francis, and he had within himself an abhorrence for lepers, and he always tried to avoid them, but he saw this leper coming towards him along the road, and St. Francis realized God is in everything, God is in him, and rather than running away from the leper, running away from the person who thinks differently from you, running away from the person of different culture or different race or different religion, he ran up and he embraced that leper and he kissed them on the cheek. And in that moment, that leper was transformed, and it was Christ who he was embracing. And we need to remember that. We need to realize that every person that we say, I don't like it that way, I don't like that way of thinking or that way of living or worshiping or that color of skin or whatever it might be, whoever we push away, we are pushing away God. We are pushing away the Christ consciousness. And so the social path to God, Master speaks of, but he also then speaks of the metaphysical step toward Christ consciousness. And that, of course, is through deep meditation, withdrawing the energy, being centered in yourself, where you begin to feel your own spiritual reality, your own centeredness in God. And when we begin to feel that, then our consciousness is transformed. And again, from the life of Buddha, we don't need to say a word, just our very presence helps people. But Master said that Buddha's first sermon was after he achieved enlightenment. He was just, again, roaming as a child awakened in God, and some people approached him. I believe they were ascetics, monks of a different tradition. And Buddha just raised his hand. But there were his consciousness, his being was so radiant, so totally permeated with peace, that even in the Master said the raising of the hand in blessings of peace was Buddha's first sermon. And just in that gesture, all those monks began following him. And that was the beginning of the Buddhist movement that has uplifted and transformed the lives of millions of people. So as we meditate, even a little bit, the Gita says, even a little bit of this inward religion, that means meditation, the metaphysical way, will free you from dire fears and colossal sufferings and help you to realize you are eternal. There is no death. There's nothing that you can lose. There's nothing anyone can take from you, because you are a spark of God. And as we move and take those steps towards Christ consciousness, we begin to, it's like casting off heavy weights. We just begin to feel lighter and freer and more joyful. And now as we, just closing, we're beginning with Palm Sunday today, Good Friday, and then Easter. You know, we're familiar with many of the world's religions, and they're really, this is in a way the gift of Christianity, this period of time, because there isn't anything exactly like it in any other religion, where we see the great leader of that religion go through this, being honored, being dishonored, being seemingly killed, and then resurrecting. There isn't anything quite like it. And really, the whole story of this week that we'll be entering, this is a very sacred time. And it's not about Christianity. I wasn't born a Christian. I wasn't raised that way. But I deeply love the life of Christ and what it represents, because it represents sort of the epitome of this week, saying, remember, there is something in you. They killed the Son of Man. They tortured the body and beat the body and put on the crown of thorns on the body, the Son of Man. But the Son of God, there's nothing that could be done to diminish or harm that. And that Son of God, that Christ consciousness is who and what each of us really are. And our great masters have come to show us how to remember who and what we really are. So let's spend this week remembering especially this gift that Christ's life gave us at this time.